It was a quiet morning, just like any other. The sun rose over the sleepy town of Westfield, casting a soft golden glow across the streets. People rushed to their daily routines, mothers sending their children off to school, commuters catching the early train to work, and shopkeepers unlocking their doors, ready to begin another ordinary day. Little did they know that within hours, everything would change. At 7:45 a.m., an unmarked plane flew overhead, a low hum barely noticed by the citizens below. The aircraft, carrying a mysterious cargo, had been scheduled to land at the nearby airport. The public had no idea that the cargo was not just ordinary goods, but something much more dangerous. The virus, now airborne and rapidly mutating, was about to spread across the globe, altering life as everyone knew it. Inside the town's local diner, Bill, a grizzled, middle-aged man with a fondness for strong coffee, overheard an odd conversation between two strangers at the counter. They whispered about strange occurrences happening in other parts of the country, but their words seemed almost too bizarre to take seriously. The names of cities where strange attacks were reported, and rumors of people going mad, made Bill's unease grow. Still, he shrugged it off, dismissing it as just another conspiracy theory. Meanwhile, at the Westfield High School, students were settling into their first period. In the gymnasium, a group of teens chatted excitedly about the upcoming weekend, while in the classrooms, teachers went over their lesson plans. Among them was a young biology teacher, Sarah, who had just finished her class on the human immune system. Little did she know, the very concept of immunity was about to be turned on its head. At 9 a.m., the first wave hit. It started with a loud, unexplainable crash at the city's train station. The panic spread quickly as people saw the first signs of something gone horribly wrong. Screams echoed as commuters tried to flee, but many were caught by what seemed like an enraged mob. These were no ordinary rioters, there was something terrifyingly unnatural about their movements. Their eyes were bloodshot, their skin pale, and their bodies contorted in ways that seemed human but not quite right. Sarah, in the middle of explaining a lesson on the brain, heard the distant screams from outside. She quickly ran to the window, her heart racing as she saw chaos erupting in the streets. People were running for their lives, but the hordes of strange figures quickly overwhelmed them. The local police had no way of controlling the situation. Worse, Sarah noticed that several people, once victims, were now turning into something else, something deadly. They weren't just injured, they were changing. In the town center, a frantic phone call came into the local sheriff, Dave. His voice crackled through the line as he tried to understand what was happening. Reports were coming in from every corner of the town, people turning on each other, biting and attacking, and then, rising again. The word zombie had been used more than once in the chaotic calls, but Dave didn't believe it at first. This couldn't be real, could it? Bill, still in the diner, felt a sharp pang of panic when he saw the first few figures dragging themselves toward the glass windows. They were different now, no longer the friendly faces he had seen just moments ago. With horror, he realized that these were the same people who had just been waiting for the bus, but now, their faces were twisted with hunger, and their movements were unnatural. He rushed for the back door, realizing that the peaceful town he'd called home was being overtaken by something beyond his comprehension. Sarah, after witnessing the nightmare unfold before her eyes, grabbed her purse and rushed to the door. The school was on lockdown, but she had no idea if it was even safe to stay there. The only thing that mattered now was survival. She bolted down the hallway, hoping to find a way out before it was too late. Sheriff Dave, now armed and leading a group of survivors, was doing everything he could to keep the town from collapsing. He set up barricades and made calls for reinforcements, but it was clear, no one was coming. The only thing left to do was to face the undead head-on. The town of Westfield, once peaceful and quiet, was now engulfed in chaos. People were fighting for their lives, and for many, it was already too late. The undead were among them, spreading faster than anyone could keep up with. The question was no longer whether they would survive, but how long they could hold out. As the sun climbed higher, it became clear, the world had just changed forever. As the morning wore on, the chaos in Westfield only intensified. Sarah, with her heart pounding in her chest, rushed through the hallways of Westfield High, praying that she could make it to her car. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear, as she heard the distant, bone-chilling sounds of screams mixed with the guttural growls of the undead. The school's once vibrant halls now seemed eerily empty, save for the occasional figure stumbling aimlessly in the distance. She didn't stop running until she reached the parking lot. Her car was parked in the far corner, and she had to weave her way through a maze of abandoned vehicles. As she neared her car, she noticed a group of students huddled by a row of cars, their faces pale and eyes wide with terror. They had all seen the same horror unfold. Some of them were clutching makeshift weapons, bats, metal pipes, anything they could grab. Sarah could feel the weight of their fear as they looked to her for guidance. "Sarah," one of the students, Jake, called out. "What do we do now?" She didn't have an answer. Sarah's mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. Her once orderly world had collapsed into an apocalyptic nightmare. But there was no time for doubt. She had to lead them out of here. "Get in the car, now!" Sarah commanded, her voice shaking but firm. The student scrambled into her car as she fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling. Once they were inside, she slammed the door shut, cranked the engine, and drove as fast as she could down the deserted streets of Westfield. Bill, meanwhile, was already on the move. The diner was no longer safe, and the small group of survivors he had gathered together knew that they couldn't stay where they were. He had seen the horrors of the undead firsthand, people he had known for years now turned into savage, flesh-eating creatures. They were outnumbered, and it seemed as though every minute more people were being infected. "We need to find a safe place," Bill said, his voice grim as he addressed the group of survivors. "There's a farm on the outskirts of town. We'll head there. It's isolated, and it might give us the best chance of survival." The group agreed, and they quickly piled into the few cars that were still working. The streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional moan of the undead drifting in from nearby buildings. As they passed the local train station, Bill couldn't help but notice how lifeless the town felt. Where once there had been busy people going about their business, now there were only the dead and the few who were still running for their lives. Sheriff Dave, on the other hand, had taken charge of a small group of survivors, trying to hold out in the town's police station. Armed with whatever weapons they could find, they barricaded the doors and set up a defensive perimeter. The situation was dire. They had no reinforcements, no backup, and the undead were getting closer with every passing hour. But Sheriff Dave refused to give up. He wasn't going to let his town fall without a fight. "Stay sharp," Dave ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos outside. "We're not going down without a fight. We'll hold this position until help arrives." But deep down, Dave knew that help wasn't coming. The government's emergency response systems had failed. Communications were down, and no one seemed to know how widespread the outbreak had become. What had started as a small outbreak in one town could very well have spread across the entire country, and beyond. Inside the police station, the survivors did their best to remain calm. Most of them had never seen combat, let alone faced something as horrifying as the undead. But survival instincts kicked in, and they were learning fast. Weapons were shared, plans were made, and the group fortified their defenses, hoping to last another day. Sarah, meanwhile, was driving as fast as she dared, her eyes scanning the streets for any signs of danger. She knew the town was no longer safe. The quiet neighborhoods that had once been familiar now seemed like death traps. She saw the unmistakable signs of the undead, people shambling through the streets, attacking anyone in sight. She had to stay focused, she couldn't afford to panic. As they reached the outskirts of town, Sarah made a sharp turn onto the dirt road that led to the farm. It was a secluded area, and she hoped that they might be able to find shelter there. But as they neared the farm, her heart sank. The farm's front gate was wide open, and the field surrounding the house looked abandoned. No sign of life. Then, suddenly, from behind them, the unmistakable sound of growling filled the air. Zombies had caught up with them, and there was no time to escape. Sarah slammed on the brakes as the car screeched to a halt. She looked at the others, fear in her eyes, knowing that they had reached a critical moment. They were about to face the fight of their lives. This is part 2 of your story. Would you like me to continue with the next part? Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she slammed the gear shift into park. The growls grew louder, closer, until the low, guttural sound seemed to fill the entire car. She glanced over at the students, their faces ashen with fear. There was no time to waste. "We need to move, now," she shouted, her voice rising above the terror outside. Without a word, the group scrambled out of the car, a few grabbing their backpacks, others clutching whatever makeshift weapon they had managed to find. Jake, the student who had called to her earlier, reached for her arm. "Sarah, we can't just run in there. What if the farm is already overrun?" She glanced at the small farmhouse in the distance. The open gate, the silence, it didn't feel right. But they had nowhere else to go. The streets of Westfield were crawling with the undead, and they couldn't afford to drive any further. "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, her voice firm. "We need to find shelter, and fast. We'll check the house. Stay close to me and keep your eyes open." The group moved cautiously toward the farmhouse, their footsteps muffled by the dry dirt beneath their feet. Sarah led the way, her senses heightened, scanning every shadow, every corner, anticipating danger. Each creak of the wooden fence, each rustling of the leaves, made her jump. As they neared the house, Sarah noticed something strange. The front door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. She motioned for the group to stop. The others clustered around her, eyes wide, fear clawing at their throats. They all knew the danger. If the house was occupied by zombies, they would be trapped, with nowhere to run. "We have to go inside and check," Sarah whispered. "Stay behind me." She reached for the door, hesitated for a moment, and then pushed it open. The old hinges creaked loudly in the eerie silence. The living room was empty, too empty. Furniture lay scattered about, but there was no sign of anyone. No survivors. No bodies. Just dust, shadows, and the overwhelming sense that they weren't alone. They moved further into the house, creeping through each room, carefully checking closets and under beds. But it was all the same. Nothing but empty space. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but her relief was short-lived. Her eyes fell on a blood-stained rug in the corner of the room. It was the first sign of violence, and it sent a chill down her spine. Suddenly, a loud crash from the kitchen shattered the silence. A scream tore through the air, followed by another. The group froze, wide-eyed, as the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps drew nearer. "Zombies!" Jake shouted, panic in his voice. Without a moment's hesitation, Sarah grabbed the nearest object, a rusted shovel leaning against the wall, and held it out in front of her. "We fight. We don't have a choice." The group braced themselves as the kitchen door burst open, revealing a pair of gnarled, decaying figures stumbling into the room. The air was thick with the stench of death. The zombies' eyes were vacant, lifeless, but the hunger in their movements was unmistakable. They didn't stumble like the ones in the streets. These creatures were fast, too fast for Sarah's comfort. With no time to think, she swung the shovel with all her strength, connecting with one of the zombies' skulls. The sound of impact was sickening, but the creature didn't stop. It grunted and lunged toward her, its sharp, yellow teeth snapping at the air. Jake, wide-eyed and terrified, swung a metal pipe at the other zombie, but it barely phased it. The zombie reached out and grabbed him, its rotting hands clutching at his shirt. Jake screamed as he struggled to break free, but the zombie's grip was unrelenting. "Jake, no!" Sarah shouted, swinging the shovel again, this time catching the zombie's arm and knocking it back. Bill, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room with 2 other survivors, both armed with whatever they could find. Bill raised a crowbar and swung it with precision, hitting the first zombie in the head, sending it crashing to the floor. But it wasn't over. The second zombie, still clutching Jake, pulled him closer, dragging him toward its gaping mouth. "Get off him!" Sarah cried, grabbing the zombie by its hair and pulling it back. It was a fight for survival. With adrenaline pumping through her veins, Sarah slammed the shovel into the zombie's skull again and again until it finally collapsed, its decaying body falling limp at her feet. Jake, gasping for breath, pushed the zombie off of him and scrambled to his feet. "Thanks, Sarah," he said, still trembling. "We're not out of the woods yet," Bill said grimly, scanning the room. The sound of shuffling footsteps echoed from upstairs. "We need to move. Now." With no time to lose, the group bolted for the back door, Sarah taking the lead. She didn't look back, but she could hear the zombies growing louder, closer. They weren't going to give up. And the farmhouse, which had seemed like their safe haven, was now just another battleground. Outside, they ran toward the fields, the once peaceful landscape now a place of terror. The open spaces left them vulnerable, but they had no choice. They couldn't stay inside any longer. The undead were closing in on them, and every moment counted. This is part 3 of your story. Would you like me to continue with part 4? The sun was beginning to dip low in the sky, casting an eerie orange glow over the vast, empty fields. Sarah, Bill, and the others stumbled across the rough terrain, hearts racing and breath coming in quick bursts. Behind them, the farmhouse had fallen silent, but the threat of the undead still loomed large. Every few seconds, Sarah glanced over her shoulder, making sure no one was left behind. "Keep moving!" Bill shouted, his voice strained but urgent. "We need to find higher ground, somewhere we can defend ourselves." They hadn't run far before Sarah realized that they were in unfamiliar territory. The farm, which had once seemed like their last hope, was now a death trap. Zombies were everywhere, shambling through the open fields like shadows in the twilight. Every rustle of the grass seemed to be followed by a low growl, the chilling sound of the undead closing in. Sarah's mind raced. Where could they go? The roads were blocked by abandoned cars, and the only way out of Westfield was through a labyrinth of deserted streets, each more dangerous than the last. She had heard rumors about a group of survivors in a nearby town, but that felt like a lifetime ago, and there was no guarantee they would be any safer there. "Up ahead," Bill said, pointing to a small hill in the distance. "We can make it there, get a better view of the surroundings. Maybe we'll spot a place to hide." They pushed forward, every step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of the world pressed down on them. Each of them was holding on to their last bit of hope, clinging to the possibility of survival as the night began to fall. But the darkness wasn't their only enemy. As they neared the hill, Sarah could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. The zombies had found them again. How could they be so fast? How had they closed the distance so quickly? Without warning, the first one emerged from the tall grass to their left. A gaunt figure with hollow eyes and blood-stained hands. It lunged at them with a speed that seemed unnatural. Sarah barely had time to react before the creature was upon her, its arms reaching for her throat. "Sarah!" Jake screamed, but he was too far behind to help. She managed to sidestep, barely evading its grasp. Her pulse surged with adrenaline as she grabbed the shovel from her pack and swung it wildly, knocking the zombie back just long enough to give herself some space. But the creature wasn't deterred. It came at her again, snarling and snapping its jaws. Bill rushed forward with the crowbar, hitting the zombie with all his might. The impact sent the creature flying to the side, but more were coming. Too many to count. The group was surrounded. "There's no time to think," Bill grunted, his face tense with determination. "We fight or we die." Sarah nodded, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't afford to freeze. Not now. Not when they were this close to safety. "Everyone, form a circle. Protect each other." Sarah shouted, rallying the group as the first wave of zombies closed in. The survivors scrambled into formation, weapons ready, their backs to each other as the undead surrounded them. It was a battle for survival, pure and simple. The first few zombies came at them, but the group was ready. Jake swung his pipe with everything he had, taking down the closest creature with a single blow. A young woman named Emma used her backpack as a shield, knocking one of the zombies off balance, allowing Bill to finish it off with a swift strike of his crowbar. The creatures were relentless, their eyes empty, their hunger never ceasing. With every zombie they killed, it seemed like two more took its place. The group was outnumbered, but they fought with everything they had, knowing that one mistake could be their last. Sarah's mind raced. How long could they keep this up? They had no weapons beyond what they had scavenged, no real training in combat. It was sheer willpower and desperation that kept them standing, pushing forward in the face of overwhelming odds. And then, just as the situation seemed dire, a loud, thunderous noise split the air. At first, Sarah thought it was just another growl from the undead, but as the sound grew louder, she realized it was something else entirely. A vehicle. A military vehicle, by the looks of it, racing toward them down the dirt road. "Over here!" Bill shouted, waving his arms frantically. The sound of the vehicle's engine roared in their ears as it came closer, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah didn't dare believe it at first. Was this a rescue? Or was it more trouble? The vehicle skidded to a halt in front of them, dust flying everywhere. The door swung open, and a gruff voice called out, "Get in! Now!" Without hesitation, Sarah and the others ran for the vehicle, their legs barely able to carry them. They climbed in, collapsing into the seats, gasping for air. As the door slammed shut behind them, the vehicle sped away, tearing down the road away from the chaos. The group looked at one another, a mixture of relief and exhaustion on their faces. But Sarah's mind was still racing. They had escaped the zombies for now, but what about tomorrow? The world had changed. The fight wasn't over. They had survived this round, but how long could they last? As the vehicle sped away into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't seen the worst of what was coming. This is part 4 of your story. Would you like me to continue with part 5? The hum of the military vehicle's engine was a soothing sound, a strange contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Sarah leaned back in her seat, trying to calm her racing thoughts. The others sat in silence, their faces pale and their eyes wide with shock. The adrenaline rush was wearing off, leaving behind the heavy weight of exhaustion. Bill was the first to speak, his voice low and weary. "Who are they? Why were they here?" He glanced over at the soldier driving the vehicle, his brow furrowed in confusion. The soldier, a tall man with short-cropped hair and a serious expression, didn't respond immediately. He kept his eyes focused on the road ahead, navigating the winding dirt path with practiced ease. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Name's Sergeant Miller," he said gruffly. "We've been sweeping the area, looking for survivors. You're not the first group we've found, but you're the first to make it this far. We'll take you to a safe zone." Safe zone. The words hung in the air like a lifeline. Sarah tried to hold on to that hope, but doubt gnawed at her. She had seen too much to trust anyone completely, even someone wearing a military uniform. The world was no longer what it had been. It had been torn apart by the undead, and now, survival was the only thing that mattered. "How long until we get there?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but laced with concern. Sergeant Miller glanced over at her, his eyes unreadable. "About an hour. The safe zone's a fortified location, military-controlled. It's the best shot you've got right now." The words were comforting, but they didn't erase the gnawing feeling in Sarah's gut. What if the safe zone wasn't all it seemed? What if it had already fallen to the zombies? The thought haunted her, but there was nothing they could do except keep moving forward. Jake, sitting next to Sarah, let out a deep sigh. "This is insane. 1 minute, we're in class, and the next, we're fighting for our lives." He ran a hand through his messy hair, frustration written across his face. What happened? How did this all go so wrong? Sarah opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. She didn't know. No one did. The outbreak had come without warning, spreading faster than anyone could understand. First, it was rumors, isolated incidents, strange reports. Then, it was everywhere. The media went silent, and people stopped leaving their homes. By the time anyone realized the scope of the disaster, it was too late. Bill nodded, his eyes distant. It's like the world ended overnight. Maybe it did, Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible. The vehicle bounced over another pothole, and Sarah's grip tightened on the seat. The roads were rough, and the surroundings were eerily quiet. The countryside, once full of life and movement, now lay abandoned. The occasional abandoned vehicle littered the side of the road, a silent reminder of what had been lost. A few scattered houses and barns stood along the way, but no one seemed to be there. No survivors. No answers. Minutes turned into an hour, and Sarah's anxiety only grew. Her mind raced through the possibilities. What would they find when they arrived at the safe zone? Could they truly find safety there? Or was it just another mirage, a place where they could momentarily catch their breath before the storm hit again? The vehicle finally slowed, the tires crunching on gravel as they neared a large, high chain-link fence. Sarah squinted through the windshield, her eyes catching sight of a guarded checkpoint ahead. Armed soldiers moved along the perimeter, their eyes scanning the horizon, weapons ready. Behind them stood a large, fortified compound, with makeshift barricades and guard towers. As they approached the gate, Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. This was it. They had made it. For now. Sergeant Miller slowed the vehicle to a stop, and a soldier in a tower raised his hand, signaling for them to halt. A loud, metallic clanking sound followed as the massive gate slowly opened. The vehicle rolled forward, passing through the checkpoint and into the compound. Inside the safe zone, there was a strange sense of calm, a silence that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the world outside. Sarah took in the sight of the compound, rows of tents, military vehicles, and armed guards patrolling the area. It looked like a temporary settlement, hastily thrown together in the wake of the disaster. The vehicle came to a stop in front of a large building, its windows dark and its door guarded by armed soldiers. Sergeant Miller cut the engine and turned to the group. "Welcome to the safe zone," he said, his voice still gruff. "It's not much, but it's secure. For now." The door of the vehicle swung open, and Sarah and the others climbed out, their legs unsteady from the long, tense journey. A few other survivors were gathered near the entrance, sitting on benches and talking quietly. They looked tired, just like Sarah and the others, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes, hope that, in this place, they might have a chance to rebuild. Sarah scanned the area, trying to get a feel for the place. The soldiers here were serious, vigilant. But there was something else, something in the air that didn't sit right with her. It was a feeling of tension, of uncertainty. She had seen too much to believe that any place was truly safe anymore. As she stood there, taking in the scene, she noticed a group of people gathered around a fire in the distance. Their faces were obscured by shadows, but Sarah could hear snippets of their conversation. They were talking about the outbreak, about the undead, about the world they had once known. But no one was talking about the future. As Sarah stood there, watching the flickering firelight, she realized that the safe zone was only the beginning. The real battle wasn't just against the zombies, it was against everything the world had become. And in the coming days, they would all have to face that reality head-on. This is part 5 of your story. Would you like me to continue with part 6? The following days in the safe zone were an unsettling mix of relief and tension. The compound, surrounded by towering fences and guarded checkpoints, was a fragile semblance of security in a world now dominated by the undead. Sarah, Bill, Jake, and the others spent their time getting acclimated, trying to make sense of their new reality. Every moment felt like a fragile breath between life and death. At first glance, the safe zone seemed like an oasis in the chaos, with its organized lines of tents, military vehicles, and armed soldiers keeping watch over the perimeter. But the more Sarah observed, the more she realized that something wasn't quite right. The air in the compound felt heavy, like a storm was brewing just out of sight. People moved with a sense of urgency, and whispers floated through the crowd, as if everyone was waiting for something, or dreading it. Sarah couldn't put her finger on it. She tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to her like a shadow. It didn't help that Sergeant Miller, the man who had rescued them, had grown increasingly distant since their arrival. He spent more time speaking with high-ranking officers, disappearing into the command center for hours at a time, and when he did return, he would barely acknowledge the survivors. The promise of safety seemed hollow. One evening, as Sarah sat by the campfire, trying to take solace in the warmth of the flames, she overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. "Do you think they'll ever find us?" A woman's voice, trembling, came from a group sitting nearby. "I don't know," a man replied. "But they're not coming back for us anytime soon. I overheard some of the soldiers talking. Things aren't as safe as they make it seem." Sarah leaned in slightly, her curiosity piqued. She had always prided herself on being observant, and the more she listened, the more she realized that the soldiers knew more than they were letting on. "Do you think it's just the zombies?" another voice asked. "I'm not so sure," the first man said in a hushed tone. "There are rumors. People are saying that some of the military leaders, they've been working with the infected. They're trying to make deals with them. I've seen strange things in the back of the compound, things I shouldn't have seen." Sarah's heart raced as she tried to process the conversation. Working with the infected? That was impossible. How could anyone trust the zombies, let alone make deals with them? But the unease Sarah had been feeling since arriving here suddenly made sense. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. She didn't dare stay to eavesdrop any longer. Her instincts told her that it was time to move, time to investigate. But how? She wasn't a soldier, and she didn't have the resources to dig into this conspiracy on her own. She could feel her pulse quicken, a wave of panic creeping in, but she pushed it down. She couldn't afford to panic. Not now. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her makeshift cot, her mind racing. The safe zone was supposed to be their refuge. But what if it wasn't? What if the people running it were just as dangerous as the zombies outside the walls? There had to be answers, and Sarah was determined to find them. The next morning, she decided to take action. She knew she couldn't do this alone, she needed the others. She found Bill and Jake near the compound's central area, checking their supplies. They looked up when she approached. "Something's off," Sarah said, her voice low. "I overheard a conversation last night. People are saying that the military here might be working with the infected. We need to figure out what's really going on." Bill and Jake exchanged a look, their expressions grave. "You really think that's possible?" Jake asked, his voice laced with skepticism. "I don't know," Sarah replied, "but we can't just sit here and wait. If it's true, we're all in danger." Bill nodded slowly. "All right, we'll help you investigate. But we need to be careful. If anyone finds out what we're doing—" "I know," Sarah interrupted, her eyes sharp. "We move quietly. We can't afford to get caught." Together, they began to devise a plan. The compound was heavily guarded, but there were weak spots. The soldiers were busy with patrols, and the area around the perimeter was less monitored. Sarah had noticed a few gaps in the security, areas where the fences weren't as tightly guarded. It wouldn't be easy, but it was their only chance. Later that day, while the majority of the survivors were at the central mess area, Sarah, Bill, and Jake slipped away from the main compound and into the shadows. They moved quickly and quietly, sticking to the perimeter, avoiding the guards. Every step they took felt like an eternity, and every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves sent their hearts racing. They reached the back of the compound, an area that seemed more abandoned and less guarded. The buildings here were run down, with broken windows and empty rooms. Sarah led the way, her mind focused on the task at hand. She could feel the weight of their mission pressing down on her. If they found something, anything, tied to the rumors, it would change everything. As they entered one of the buildings, the air felt thick and musty. Dust hung in the air, and the silence was deafening. They moved carefully, stepping lightly over broken glass and debris, until they reached a locked door at the back of the building. Bill tried the handle, locked. But that didn't stop him. "Give me a second," Bill whispered. He pulled out a small tool from his pocket and began working on the lock. Sarah held her breath, glancing nervously at Jake. They couldn't afford to make any noise. Not now. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open. Beyond it was a long hallway, dimly lit and lined with empty offices. But Sarah didn't care about the offices. She was looking for answers. They stepped inside, the tension in the air palpable, and proceeded further into the building. Then they heard it, a noise from deeper inside the compound. The unmistakable shuffle of footsteps, and the faint growl of something, or someone, not quite human. This is part 6 of your story. Would you like to continue with part 7? The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she motioned for Bill and Jake to stay quiet. Her heart was pounding, a steady rhythm of fear and adrenaline. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the dim lighting casting eerie shadows on the walls. Every corner felt like it might conceal something, someone. "Do you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaky. Sarah nodded, her eyes darting to the end of the hallway where the sound seemed to originate. The unmistakable shuffle of heavy feet, the occasional scrape of claws on the floor, it was a sound that sent a chill down her spine. "We need to move," Sarah urged, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." They pressed themselves against the walls, careful not to make a sound as they crept toward the source of the noise. With each step, the growl became clearer, more distinct. Sarah's gut tightened. Whatever, or whoever, it wasn't human. Not anymore. Suddenly, a shadow passed under the dim light ahead of them. Sarah froze, signaling for Bill and Jake to halt. Her eyes narrowed as she peered down the hallway. In the distance, a figure was moving, slowly, purposefully. At first glance, it seemed like one of the soldiers, but Sarah quickly realized that something was terribly wrong. The soldier's movements were jerky, unnatural, and as it came into the light, she could see its face. It was covered in a grotesque layer of decay, the skin pale and mottled, the eyes vacant and dead. It wasn't a soldier. It was one of them, one of the infected. Sarah's stomach turned, and she had to fight the urge to vomit. The zombie staggered toward them, its eyes locking onto them. It sniffed the air, as if sensing their presence, and then it let out a low growl. It was only moments away from spotting them. "Back! Back!" Sarah hissed, and the trio quickly retreated into the nearest room, slamming the door behind them. They pressed their bodies against the wall, barely breathing, waiting for the sound of the zombie's shuffling footsteps to fade. After what felt like an eternity, the growls died down, and the footsteps faded into the distance. "That was too close," Jake said, his voice barely audible. He was pale, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of the desk in the room. "We can't stay here," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "We need to keep moving." They quickly checked the door again to make sure it was still secured, and then moved further down the hallway. The deeper they went into the compound, the more they realized just how much danger they were in. The walls, once white, were stained with dark streaks of something that could have been blood. The doors to various rooms stood ajar, some of them showing signs of forced entry. There was no telling what they would find behind them. Eventually, they reached a large conference room. The door was closed, but Sarah could hear voices inside, low and hushed. She motioned for Bill and Jake to stay quiet, and then slowly eased the door open, just enough to peer inside. What she saw sent a chill through her. At the far end of the room, several high-ranking officers were seated at a table. They were talking, but their voices were muffled by the heavy door. What caught Sarah's attention was the figure standing near the back of the room, partially hidden in shadow. It was another soldier, but there was something off about him. His posture was stiff, and his eyes, when they caught the light, glowed unnaturally. "That's one of the soldiers from the patrol earlier," Bill whispered, his eyes narrowing. But Sarah shook her head. "No, that's not him. He's different. I think he's one of them." She felt a wave of nausea rise in her chest. The soldier standing in the shadows was infected, just like the one they had seen earlier. But this one, he wasn't acting like a mindless zombie. He was standing upright, moving with purpose, as if he was still aware of his surroundings. The officers didn't seem to notice. They continued their conversation, oblivious to the undead figure in their midst. "I told you," one of the officers said, "the plan is working. We just need more time to prepare." Sarah strained to hear the rest of the conversation, her heart racing. "What plan?" she whispered to Bill. "I don't know," Bill muttered. "But it doesn't sound good." Suddenly, one of the officers stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "We don't have time," he snapped. "The test subjects are becoming unstable. We need more of them. We need more soldiers." The words hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Test subjects? More soldiers? The infected soldier in the shadows moved, and Sarah's stomach dropped. He wasn't just a mindless creature. He was being used, controlled. "We need to accelerate the process," the officer continued. "The city is lost, but the compound can still be used as a hub for research. We can't afford to wait any longer." Her heart thundered in her chest as she realized the truth. The military, the ones who were supposed to be protecting them, weren't trying to contain the outbreak. They were working with the infected. They were experimenting with them, using them as weapons. And worse yet, they were planning to bring more. "They're making more," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're turning people into them." Bill and Jake exchanged horrified glances. It was worse than they had imagined. The safe zone was no sanctuary, it was a prison, a breeding ground for something far more dangerous. "We have to stop them," Sarah said, her voice steady now. "We can't let them continue with this." But as they turned to leave, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. The door to the conference room had been left ajar, and the infected soldier had heard them. He was coming. This is part 7 of your story. Would you like to continue with part 8? The footsteps behind them echoed like a death knell, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The infected soldier wasn't just a mindless creature, he was coming for them, and there was no time to waste. Sarah's mind raced as she quickly signaled for Bill and Jake to retreat into a nearby storage room. They needed to hide, regroup, and come up with a plan. But as they darted inside, the door to the storage room slammed shut with a deafening crash. "Move, now!" Sarah hissed, her pulse pounding in her ears. They weren't safe yet. Inside the cramped room, they crouched behind stacks of old equipment, their breaths shallow. Sarah's eyes flickered toward the dim window near the back of the room. She could see the shadows moving outside, someone was coming closer. "Do you think he saw us?" Jake whispered, his voice shaky. His eyes were wide, scanning the darkness. "I don't know," Sarah replied, her mind whirling. "But if he did, we need to be ready." The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by the distant sounds of the infected soldier's slow shuffle as he circled the hall. Every second felt like an eternity. Sarah's mind kept returning to the conversation she had overheard. The military wasn't here to protect them, they were experimenting, trying to control the infected. The compound was ground zero for something much worse than the apocalypse itself. "We need to stop this," Bill muttered, his voice tense with resolve. "Whatever they're doing, we can't let it spread. We've seen enough." Sarah nodded, her jaw clenched with determination. "We'll find a way to shut it down. But we need to get out of here first. If that soldier raises the alarm, we're done for." Just then, the door to the storage room creaked open. A shadow filled the doorway, and the faint groan of the infected soldier echoed through the room. The door had been cracked enough to allow just a sliver of light to filter in, illuminating the figure of the zombie standing just outside. The soldier's glowing eyes scanned the room, the smell of decay wafting in through the crack in the door. He was close. Too close. Sarah's heart raced, and she motioned for Bill and Jake to stay still, as if holding her breath would somehow make them invisible. The soldier's head turned slightly, as if sensing something was wrong. His gaze locked onto the storage room. It was now or never. "Jake, Bill, on my mark," Sarah whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. "We make a run for it. We don't stop. We head for the command center. It's our only shot. Got it, Bill replied, his voice low but steady. They waited, every muscle tensed in anticipation. Then, without another word, Sarah counted silently in her head, reaching the breaking point. Go, she shouted. The three of them bolted forward in a flash, crashing through the door with a suddenness that sent the infected soldiers stumbling back. The door slammed against the wall with a loud bang as they rushed into the hall. The soldier let out an eerie, guttural growl, but they didn't look back. They couldn't afford to. They sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they reached the main corridor. The compound seemed to be alive with movement, soldiers, staff members, and a few panicked survivors were all around them. But Sarah and her group weren't interested in the chaos. They had one objective, the command center. They turned a corner and nearly collided with a group of soldiers coming the other way. Before the soldiers could react, Sarah yanked a fire extinguisher from a nearby wall and sprayed them down, the foam clouding the air in a moment of confusion. They pushed past the dazed soldiers and kept running, their footsteps echoing louder with each passing second. The command center was just ahead, a fortified room where the highest-ranking officials in the compound made their decisions. Sarah knew that was where they could find the answers, or at least, the key to stopping this madness. As they reached the door, Bill tried to force it open. It was locked. Help me! Bill grunted, his hands shaking as he fiddled with the keypad. Jake and Sarah quickly scanned the hall behind them, their nerves on edge. The sound of the infected soldiers' growls was getting closer, louder, almost too close for comfort. Time was running out. Finally, with a beep, the door unlocked. Bill flung it open, and the trio rushed inside, locking the door behind them. The room was filled with a handful of high-ranking officers, who looked up in shock as the survivors stormed in. "Who the hell are you?" one of the officers began, but his words died in his throat as he saw the desperation in their eyes. "We know what you're doing here," Sarah said, her voice cold. "We know about the infected soldiers, the experiments. We know you've been using them as weapons." The officers exchanged uncertain glances, but Sarah could see the truth in their eyes. The plans, the research, it was all right here on the monitors. On one screen, she could see images of the infected being controlled, some of them still wearing military uniforms, walking like soldiers. "No one leaves here alive unless you stop what you're doing," Sarah continued, her voice shaking with barely contained rage. "If you want to save yourselves, you'll end this. Now." For a moment, the room was still. Then, one of the officers finally spoke, his voice trembling. We were trying to save humanity," he said, his voice cracking. "We thought we could control them. Use them as weapons." "Control them?" Bill snapped. "You've made them into monsters. You've sealed your own fate, just like the rest of us." There was no time left for words. The infected soldier was almost upon them, and as the door trembled under the pressure of his relentless approach, Sarah knew they had one final choice to make. Fight, or run. With a final glance at the officers, Sarah said, "It ends here. One way or another. The end." That concludes the story They Came Without Warning, The Day the World Changed Forever, Zombies Audiobooks. If you'd like to revise or expand on any part, feel free to let me know.